the Leadership Exchange podcast, a conversation with Christopher Pietroni, Professor of Leadership Practice and Director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Leadership Exchange podcast with me, your host, Christopher Pietroni. This podcast is brought to you by the University of Birmingham, where I'm Professor of Leadership Practice and Director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute. In this podcast, we ask whether we have the right kind of leadership to meet the challenges that we face, or whether we need to exchange current approaches towards leadership for something new. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Lomas. Mark is currently the head of culture at Lloyd's of London, but Mark's led diversity and inclusion work across a whole range of sectors, including as head of equality, diversity and inclusion at HS2. For those who don't know, HS2 is one of the largest infrastructure projects in Europe, involved in building high-speed rail between the south and the north of England. But Mark's also worked in the third sector. He's worked at the BBC, he's worked alongside the NHS and organisations like Arts Council England. So his range of experience in this area is really broad and is going to make for what I'm sure is going to be a really rich conversation this afternoon. Welcome, Mark. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So you're at Lloyd's of London, and it might be helpful for you, just for those who don't know, to say a little bit about what Lloyd's does. But Lloyd's, of course, has a history utterly impossible to disentangle from the legacy of empire and the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And that history kind of, has only quite recently been considered. And I know that you said that you think it's really important to confront our history. And I just wonder how you see that in terms of problem awareness, because there might be people in the way that you describe who say, well, look, I get that this is our history, but that's not me, and that's not part of it. So why do you think it matters to confront that sort of history, as part of trying to really understand what it is that we're trying to change?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important, because if you can't be open and transparent about the past, you can't confront the issues of the past, then it is really hard to acknowledge the issues of today, and what the required solutions are. Now, that doesn't mean that people are universally happy about that. There's certainly sentiment that I've encountered, like, why are we doing this? It was hundreds of years ago, that sort of thing. Or, you're right, it had nothing to do with me. It's horrible, but I don't really want to know about it because it had nothing to do with me. And that is a minority of sentiment, but you do run across that sentiment. But it is important for a few reasons. Number one, if you're trying to build an inclusive future, an inclusive marketplace, and a global marketplace, you have to start with the reality, and that's hugely important, because if you're hiding the reality in a world where there's lots of information available, when you're trying to attract talent, they will see what you're portraying is different than the truth. And that is problematic. That immediately leads to a breakdown in trust. The second part of that is there are so many interesting sort of lessons to be learned about how systemic a way of working and operating can be, and unpicking all of that takes a lot of time. It's also very important to have the context behind it, because while certainly some of the activities of people who are involved in were absolutely abhorrent by today's standards, they weren't actually illegal in those times. So there's certainly a need to provide the whole context, and to look at things truthfully. And then I think really critically allow people to respond to those findings, respond to the data that you're pulling out. Explain my own experience. When I went into the Lloyd's building as part of meeting the teams, I personally found it odd. You're surrounded by all this history, but the history isn't quite reflective of what happened. And so we put a lot of work into sort of recurating some of the displays in the Lloyd's building. And again, this research will result in a digital archive, digital exhibition, sorry, so that people can access the objects, their history, the context, for as long as needed.
How have you dealt with, because that's a kind of leadership task. How do we create the environments in which people are willing to be more honest, really, about the degree of change and challenge that we're facing?
And that is, it's a great question, and leadership plays such an important role in moving the dial. That setting of the psychological safety, often comes from how leaders interact with this subject. Even something like, we need you to give us your diversity data. You need to create, the environment, a trusting environment for people to do that. And you can't just assume that people know why that data is important. And so you really do need to be able to explain, you gave us this data, we introduced this policy. This is about making this organization better for you, and that you is applicable to whoever you are across this organization. So that's very important. The role modeling is also very important for leaders. And then on an organizational basis, I think the kind of trepidation over kind of diversity data probably a little less than it was. Primarily because people are more demanding of that data, of that transparency. And so you can't claim to be, a wonderfully inclusive, diverse employer, but they'll go onto your website and they'll find out, right? Yeah. They'll go to your LinkedIn, they'll find out. So, being able to marshal that data and publish that data, again, goes towards that trust factor. Which becomes incredibly important if you're trying to reach into communities that you haven't traditionally accessed. And so that is a leadership task to say that this is our stall, these are our values, this is where we are, and this is kind of where we want to get to and how we want to improve. And honesty about that is incredibly important. Over promising and not being able to deliver in this space, particularly, is probably the worst thing you can do, because once that perception sets in that you are disingenuous, it is incredibly difficult to shift. And I think one of the leadership qualities of a successful diversity professional, I think, has to be the ability to create those psychologically safe spaces for people, both to come and raise issues with you, to talk about their experience. And the way you respond to that is extremely important, because you cannot fix everything immediately.
Yeah, and that point about you can't fix everything immediately, goes also to the question of the sort of systemic nature of the challenge, right? So I was struck, Mark, as you were describing it, you were saying, well, being transparent and being open and being honest is actually part of what builds the trust, particularly if you're trying to reach into, either as customers or presumably as potential employees, communities that might not traditionally have seen you as a partner or an institution that you would want to be part of. So those two things kind of but then of course, if you do reach into those communities, you bring more people into the institution. On the one hand, that's great, that increases diversity, but of course, as we know, historically, one of the problems has been people come into organizations and then discover that they're not able to progress because, yes, we might have dealt with recruitment, but we haven't dealt with kind of promotion and internal culture. So all of these things are deeply interconnected, aren't they? And that notion of creating a culture in the market and using those quasi-regulatory kind of tools at your disposal to provide both carrot and stick. I wonder how similar that is in general terms to the kind of culture within an organization? Because I mean, your formal job title, I think at Lloyd's, is head of culture, right?
Yeah, that's
And
right.
you know, I'm sure both of us have been involved in more quotes culture change programs than we would care to remember. And one of the things we know about most culture change programs is that they fail, right? So you know, there's plenty of business school case on that. And so, you know, so I'm sort of curious about that part of this as well, right? Because I think the whole one of the big themes of what you've been talking about and we've been exploring is, you know, there are lots of things that you need to do, the sum total of which is, one hopes, a kind of systemic shift, right? Where the whole nature of the organization is different and therefore the outcomes are different. And but at the heart of culture change, often, you know, we're asking people to really change the way that they see things, right? That we're doing a sort of mindset change, a sort of perspective shift change. And I wonder how you see the process of achieving that in an area like equality and diversity. So yes, there's carrot and stick, but what in your experience is at the heart of enabling people to kind of see the world differently, so they're making different choices when they're deciding how to act in any given moment? In, you know, am I going to act in a more or less inclusive way, is really down to a whole set of kind of internal decisions that I'm going to make in a flash, right? So how do you get that sort of culture change so that people really are behaving differently, or what helps?
It is a long-term process, right? It's not something you do in 6 months. It's just not achievable. But I'm a big believer in you change the system around people. So a good example of that. I'm a real believer in the use of company values to help nudge and change behaviors. Now, those values can't just be, you know, a picture on a wall. They need to be active. They need to be lived every day. People need to be recognized for behaving in a way that's in line with the values. And then, you know, if your values are representative of diversity, inclusion, or D&I is threaded within that, and you articulate that, you then have a framework for which people understand this is a means by which the organization operates. And you take that framework and then you bake it into all the things that matter to people. You know, you bake it into the performance and pay discussion. So it doesn't just become about what you did, but how you did it. You know, you bake it into the informal and formal recognition processes for people. So they want to do that. You know, you remind people with stats and facts and little conversation starters every day when they turn on their computer or they walk past the plasma screen in the office. There are things about the values or what we're doing on diversity or sustainability or why it's important, why it's aligned with the company, why it's aligned with sort of company strategy, etc. And so it's over a period of time, you set that expectation. You change the system around it, lots of nudge messaging and then formal and informal systems. Over time, people understand this is the way we do things around here. And when we reach that point, well, this is the way we do things around here, then the culture's changed. And that, from a leadership point of view, that does take bravery as well, because there will be leaders who won't want to embody the values that are important or that will help you get to the outcomes you need. And you know, I think an HRD, former boss of mine, used to say, "Look, if you're not up to it, but you are up for it, then we can help you. But if you're not up for it and you're not up to it, why are you still here?" And I think that's great. And sometimes you have to be brave. You can either change the people, or sometimes you got to change the people.
Yeah. Again, that hard edge being really important, and it takes us to the kind of the place that I thought we might go last, actually, Mark, which is about sacrifice, right? So, you know, whilst I certainly believe it's true, and there's all sorts of both empirical evidence for this, but there's also a sort of values base which says more inclusion is better, right? It's better because it might be better for our business, but it's also better because, frankly, it's just better. But it seems to me that you've touched on this. There are losses along the way. Now, sometimes, that might be, well, I don't see myself in this new institution, and so there might be a genuine loss in terms of loss of role or loss of job or so on. But it seems to me there are other sorts of losses as well. Certainly something that I've come across a lot is, when even now, I think even with the greater awareness around these issues, many, as it were, people who would think of themselves as being right-minded, inclusive, and so on, being confronted with ways in which they have benefited from their own privilege, somebody who looks like me and sounds like me and so on, being confronted with that is really quite hard, because you're losing something. You're losing a sense of your own sort of goodness, if you like, and you can accommodate to that and see the world differently but think about being an ally and so on. But nevertheless, it is a loss. So there are all sorts of intangibles at work here. And I'm very struck by the, Ron Heifetz, who's a academic at Harvard that I draw on a lot, says people don't resist change, they resist loss. And so very often when we see resistance in organizational change or culture change, it's because people are confronted with the things that they're going to have to give up in order to be different in the future. So I'm just curious about your experience of this, about, if we think of sacrifice not just in the sort of hard end, but also some of that softer internal kind of material. And that feels like a real leadership space to me. And I don't know if we really develop our leaders to be able to understand that they have to offer some leadership to help people go through those kinds of processes.
I mean, I think it's a great point, and my kind of experience of it, I think, is rooted in the fact, worked with a number of different companies, different sectors, this, that, and the other internationally. British culture has a great belief in fairness. Whether or not things are fair at all is completely different. And this sort of belief in meritocracy is also very strong. And therefore, if you've been kind of indoctrinated is the wrong word, but I can't think of a better one at this point. If you've been indoctrinated to say that, things are fair, it's a meritocracy, you get what you deserve, all you got to do is work hard and blah, 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 blah. Your belief is, I got there because I'm that good. Then if certain groups of people don't get there, the inevitable conclusion is, well, I know it's not polite to say it, but they must not be as good.
Right.
And therefore, you get a diversity detriment, whereas it's a pity model. Oh, they're not quite as good, so we're going to have to help them out. That is very different from recognizing an intrinsic advantage. And it is explained, once that advantage is explained, then comes the feeling of loss. Because what to the disabled person or the woman or the LGBTQ person or the Black person is a leveling of the playing field, feels like a loss of entitlement to possibly another group.
One of the questions that we ask all of our podcast guests, Mark, is whose leadership inspires you and why?
Someone initially comes to mind, and for all you who are Manchester United fans out there, I apologize immediately. So Jurgen Klopp, for me, the Liverpool manager, embodies a type of leadership that I think is extremely effective. And why is that? He creates a vision, a common vision. This is what we're aiming at. He's able to bring people with him, and by that I mean not only his players, but the supporters in the stadium, the city outside it. And it's a very personal leadership brand, and by that I mean He is both available, accessible, but still holds a very high standard. And you talked about, making the line explicit. I think one of the things that I really admire about his sense of leadership is he makes the line explicit, but then helps people get to the line. And I think for me, that's he's a leader that I admire very, very much. I think he does a great job in that.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you, I have to say. I think one of the things that strikes me about, the sort of the way that you approach these issues is that there's this really great combination, I see anyway, between a sort of what I think of as an outside in and an inside out kind of eye. So the outside in is how do we get the systems right, but the inside out is and how do we help people kind of do the inner work required to kind of accommodate themselves to the new systems as well. And again, some wonderfully tangible examples of kind of some of the ways of doing that from these diverse sectors, which I found absolutely fascinating. But all the time, again, the other thing I sense talking with you, Mark, there's this kind of matter of factness about the sort of non-negotiable nature of this, that there's it's not at all aggressive or sort of shouty. It's just this is the line, and you be really clear about it and hold it. And just as you were closing there, your last words, I think about how we help people in our institutions to feel that level of clarity about the line and the willingness to disagree and to tolerate that. Such an important part of the work. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. It's really much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. And to our listeners, thank you as always for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time. All the details that we've discussed today will be available in the show notes. And as always, if you've enjoyed the episode and you like the podcast, do subscribe, leave us a rating and a review. And if you want to stay up to date with the Leadership Exchange podcast, check out birmingham.ac.uk/leadership-exchanged. Thanks. Until next time.
The University of Birmingham and Birmingham Leadership Institute logo. Tune in to the Leadership Exchange podcast, birmingham.ac.uk/leadership-exchanged.